How does a single election, hailed globally as the ultimate triumph of democracy, become the blueprint for a decade of political instability, violence, and targeted assassinations? How is it possible that the woman who smashed the highest ceiling in the Muslim world, challenging generals, mullahs, and the established patriarchy, was simultaneously signing her own death warrant the moment she took office? The answer lies not just in who she was, but in what her victory represented. The profound, dangerous clash between tradition and modernity in a nuclear-armed nation. To truly grasp this paradox, we must return to the precise moment this deadly tug of war began. This happened on November 16, 1988, with the election of Benazir Bhutto as Prime Minister of Pakistan. Bhutto rose to power facing enemies who had killed her father, securing victory for her party after 11 years of brutal military dictatorship. The cost of the subsequent instability was unimaginable: 3 indirect coups, 2 exiles, and eventually the violent end of a dynasty that, over 20 years, would lose 3 key members bound to assassination. Bhutto promised the future, but the past never let her go. Today, we examine how. The woman who shocked the Muslim world initiated an inevitable cycle of violence. On November 16th, the election of Benazir Bhutto as Prime Minister of Pakistan marked the day that changed everything. Yes, the cycle of violence seemed inevitable, but on November 16, 1988, the election of Benazir Bhutto as Prime Minister of Pakistan marked the day that changed everything. On that day, hope was not just an emotion, it was a proven fact. Millions of Pakistanis, thirsty for democracy after years under the iron fist of Zia-ul-Haq, flocked to the polls. The victory was resounding. Benazir, the daughter of the East, did not just win. Her PPP party secured 94 of the 207 directly elected seats, a clear mandate that resonated against deeply entrenched conservatism. For the first time in modern history, a woman would lead a Muslim state. The world paused to watch this country, forged in faith, breaking global barriers before the West even did. But behind the euphoria, the air was thick with malice. This victory was not just about a political party, it was a humiliation for the generals and the powerful intelligence agencies accustomed to dictating the nation's destiny. The Crown Bhutto War was made of thorns, and the throne she occupied sat atop a swamp of political intrigue. What appeared to be the dawn of Pakistani democracy was in reality the beginning of a relentless war against invisible power, a war that would lead Benazir to exile, and years later back to the dust on the stage of her own shattered nation. But before tragedy could complete its cycle, there was a day of glory, a fleeting instant when Pakistan believed the future could be different. It was November 16, 1988. Pakistan, after 11 years of darkness under the autocratic repression of General Zia-ul-Haq, was breathing again. Zia, who had deposed and executed Benazir's father, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, had died mysteriously in a plane crash 3 months prior, leaving a power vacuum suddenly filled by democratic hope. Benazir, the daughter of the East, returned from opposition and exile, carrying a double burden: to avenge her father's memory and to challenge centuries of patriarchal tradition. At 35, educated at the most prestigious Western universities, she was the antithesis of the militaristic conservatism that dominated the country. The military establishment and fundamentalist groups fought fiercely against her, deploying propaganda that argued a woman could not lead an Islamic state, citing religious precedent. But the streets of Karachi and Lahore on that day were boiling, not just with voters, but with the promise of a silent revolution. The results began to trickle in slowly. Benazir's Pakistan People's Party, PPP, secured 94 seats in the National Assembly. Although not an absolute majority, it was enough to form a coalition government. The sheer scale of the historical rupture was global. At that time, in 1988, no other Muslim-majority nation had elevated a woman to the highest political office. Pakistan, a nation founded on the principles of Islam, was suddenly at the forefront of female emancipation, challenging the rigid interpretation of Sharia that had been imposed by the previous regime. Benazir, Wearing her traditional shalwar kameez, her head covered with the dupatta, a sign of respect she never abandoned, was sworn into office. Her ascent was not just a political victory, it was a seismic declaration. She was, as the international press immediately dubbed her, the Iron Lady of the Muslim world. Yet, history teaches us that democratic victory is often the most fragile. The 1988 election did not sweep away the establishment. The military officials, the conservative clergy, and the invisible power of the intelligence agencies were watching Benazir closely. She had won the popular vote, but she had not won actual control of the state apparatus. This was the first victory, the sweetest, but also the most dangerous. Benazir knew, or would soon discover, that she was prime minister not by inherent right, but by temporary concession. The celebration had barely begun, and the shadows of the old guard were already moving, engineering the next act of a political tragedy that would turn glory into exile, and ultimately, into blood. The initial shock of Benazir Bhutto's victory was not just about her being a woman in a conservative Islamic nation. It lay in the very real threat she posed to the established power structure. The transition, seemingly democratic, was merely a change in the face of authority, not in its fundamental nature. She inherited a nation crippled by debt, a fiscal deficit hovering around 7% of GDP, and a political landscape poisoned by sectarian rivalry, conditions specifically designed to ensure failure. Her term was instantly mired in political trench warfare. The military intelligence, ISI, still largely loyal to the late dictator Zia-ul-Haq's legacy, viewed her as an agent of Western liberalism and a dangerous disruptor. Bhutto attempted ambitious reforms, promoting education, combating illiteracy, and initiating social welfare programs. But every initiative was met with bureaucratic stonewalling and relentless opposition orchestrated by the established political machinery. This was the dark twist. The triumph of democracy was immediately suffocated by the fragility of the institutions themselves. Just 20 months after taking the oath, the promise of November 16, 1988, collapsed. In August 1990, President Ghulam Ishaq Khan, acting under the controversial Eighth Amendment, a legacy of Zia's dictatorship, dismissed her government on charges of corruption and incompetence. She had been removed, but the power structures remained intact. This set a lethal precedent. Between 1988 and 1999, Pakistan saw 5 democratically elected governments prematurely dissolved, plunging the nation into a destabilizing cycle of hope, followed by institutional sabotage. Bhutto was the first, but certainly not the last victim. She returned to power in 1993, only to be dismissed again in 1996. The cycle was cruel, reflecting a democracy where the military and the judiciary held ultimate veto power over popular mandate. Bhutto eventually went into exile, the great pioneer reduced to a political ghost. But the story of Benazir Bhutto demanded a final devastating act. She returned in 2007, promising to restore true democracy and confront extremism. The massive crowds that greeted her proved her enduring connection to the people, but they also signed her death warrant. The system that had dismissed her twice politically ensured she would not return a third time. On December 27, 2007, in Rawalpindi, the cycle of violence reached its tragic culmination. The bullet that ended her life was not just an assassination, it was a definitive statement from the deep state. Challenging the established order carries the ultimate price. Her legacy is complex, etched in blood and resilience. She proved a woman could lead a modern Muslim state, but she also proved the heartbreaking fragility of that leadership. Today, Pakistan continues to wrestle with the military's pervasive influence, echoing the institutional weakness that swallowed Bhutto's triumph. The question remains, can the dream she ignited ever fully escape the shadow of the institutions that ensured her silence? The victory of 1988 was not a definitive ending, but the prologue to an epic tragedy. Benazir governed under constant institutional sabotage. The promise of November 16th collided brutally with the reality of Pakistani politics, where the establishment, the powerful military and the entrenched political elite, would not tolerate civilian rule, especially not in the hands of a woman and a Bhutto. She was dismissed by presidential decree in 1990 and again in 1996, the victim of corruption charges, many widely viewed as orchestrated political resistance designed to destabilize her mandates. The woman who shocked the Muslim world by demonstrating democracy's potential ultimately proved its tragic fragility. Her return from exile and her brutal assassination in 2007, 19 years after that glorious day, sealed the immense cost of her audacity. November 16, 1988, is not just the story of a pioneer. It is the fundamental lesson that true structural change is often met not with celebration, but with relentless, fatal resistance. Her election was the initial brilliant flame, but the opposing forces were the wind determined to extinguish it forever. This was just one of the days that shaped our world. Tomorrow, we will publish another landmark historical event. To make sure you don't miss out, subscribe now to The Day That Changed Everything and activate your notifications. Which other day would you like to see covered here? Comment below.